Hello, listeners. I'm excited to have a guest with us this week, Katryn Wright, who is a behavioral science lead in charge of social impact in an organization More Than Now. And I'm excited for you to meet Katryn, as she spent 10 years working in responsible business and human rights before retraining as a behavioral scientist, and she has a master's degree in behavioral change. She's across the pond in the UK and currently leads the diversity, inclusion, ethics, and leadership portfolio at More Than Now. Katryn, welcome to the show.
Hi, Julie. Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, tell us about, what a big ominous subject, behavioral science. Tell our listeners how that applies to an ever-changing field like diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Gosh, okay. Just a small question to get started. Um, yeah, sure. So, I mean, we think about behavioral science at More Than Now in two ways. Um, the first is sort of how we understand why people behave the way that they do, and why that often means that people don't behave in ways that we might want them to behave in organizations, right? So, how do we understand what barriers might be getting in the way, what obstacles people might be facing, and what gets in the way of people's often own desired behaviours, right? So New Year's resolutions is always a great place to start. We have these great intentions to change our behaviour, but why do we often find that hard to, by January the 13th, say, have followed through on those behaviours? So that's the first bit, sort of understanding why, and then the second part is understanding, well, how do you go about and change behaviour? And there's an incredible body of literature and evidence around how we can go about doing that, that's rooted in theory, rooted in evidence, and rooted in practice. Within the DEI world, within the workplace and organizational world, what we do is sort of take that theory, that evidence, that practice that's often sitting within academic communities and research communities, and apply that in real world setting, in real organizations. So we work with lots of different large organizations to put this into practice. And that means being really specific about, okay, if we have diversity, equity, and inclusion objectives, what are the behaviors that people need to
Mm.
be doing, be performing in order to get us there? So what does it mean to sort of run an inclusive hiring process? What does it mean to have equitable performance review processes?
Mhm.
What does it mean for people to feel belonging at work? And what does that mean that they would do differently? So it's really about figuring that out and then tweaking as much as possible to optimize that.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Yeah, I often, we're kind of in the midst of transition on what we call this work, at least here in the US. And I often think about diversity as the representation piece, kind of the lagging indicator. Inclusion is the behavior, to your
Mhm.
point. If we have the behaviors, we have a conducive environment.
Mhm.
And that's where belonging comes in. That's an out, byproduct of that, hopefully, and equity, right? The equitable outcomes as well. But systems need to be designed for equity. So I'm curious, Katrin, right now, like knowing the science that you know on those behavior tweaks, what does the science tell us about what helps facilitate that inclusive environment from a behavior perspective?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, great question, right? And again, a really big one. I'd say again, we think about this similarly in two ways as well. So the first is around when it comes to what those different aspects of DEIB that you mentioned in organizations mean, we can think of it in two ways. The first is around processes. So, what are
Mhm.
some of the day to day processes, experiences, moments that people, whether managers or employees, are going through where we have this opportunity to optimize that for diversity, for equity, for inclusion, for belonging, whatever aspect um, of that it might be. So that might mean, really focusing in on hiring processes and really using data to understand, okay, we don't have a challenge with diversity with representation in who's applying for the organization, but we actually do seem to have issues when it comes to interview stage or
Mhm.
CV screening. And so we have opportunities there to really de-bias from a behavior change perspective, not from a sort of, I'm going to take bias out of your mind and change your attitude and hope that things get better around here, right? But from a
Right.
behavior change perspective, how do I get people to move the representation needle through their hiring process more specifically? And we can do that in hiring, we can do that in performance, we can do that in team meetings, we can do that in one-to-ones, we can do that in any of those moments.
Mhm.
And then the other piece would be thinking about culture, right? So I described this the other day as sort of culture often gives me the sort of heebie-jeebies because it seems so unbehaviorable. It seems so woolly and fluffy. And is my culture
Right.
different to your culture? And my experience of the culture at this organization different to yours? It can feel very vague, I suppose. But when we think about it, culture is the result of the behaviors that people
Right.
around us display all the time. So, what is it that people need to practically be doing differently in project kickoffs, in work allocation meetings, in whatever those sort of cultural moments might be, those discussions around the water coolers that people can do differently? So, that's the sort of the twin lens that we would apply to getting really practical from an evidence-based perspective. There are lots of sort of disparate pieces of evidence as to how to do that really well. But I think generally, if you focus on really specific processes where you've got a great chance to intervene and to try to optimize and change those outcomes, and then those sort of cultural moments, then we know that we've got the best chance of having the most impact.
Yeah. And I know that for a number of your clients, you really dig into the data and make specific recommendations. I'm curious, Katrin, if you have a case study or a use case you could share with us on how the data tells a story.
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the sort of most, I guess, recent and most prominent examples of where we've had success around that has been with a global telecoms and engineering company based in Europe. And their challenge was that they had this sort of issue in the hiring process. So the organization was largely 75% dominated by men. The women that were in the organization tended to be in those sort of stereotypically female roles and parts of the business. And so the question was, can we move more women through the hiring life cycle, through the hiring
Mhm.
pipeline? So here we ran an experiment over probably about 6 months. Our question, originally was, what can we do to try
Mhm.
to improve this? And what we really honed in on was, we knew, as in response to your last question, that unconscious bias training was unlikely to work. We knew that the evidence, the research there,
Right.
that you could sort of train bias out of people's minds was unlikely to work. But what if we gave people a diversity reminder? What if we gave hiring managers a diversity reminder right before they were about to go through CVs, sift through CVs, and decide who to bring in to interview? So that was what we began to do. We rolled it out experimentally, and we tested a few different things against each other. The first thing that we wanted to test was against the sort of business as usual process. So we had a group of hiring managers that just went through the regular hiring process. That becomes our control group that we then are comparing everything else against. We then had a diversity focused message where we were really saying, as you decide, as you're deciding who to bring in to interview, we want you to think about how if you hire people with similar characteristics, similar experiences as you and the rest of your team, your group thinking and decision making are going to be weaker as a result. So really trying to bring someone into the team who's got a new background, a new experience, perspective that's currently underrepresented in your team.
Mhm.
And, this was back in 2021, 2022 that we were setting up this experiment. But the idea of a sort of diversity backlash wasn't necessarily new at the time, right? That's not just
Right.
something that we've experienced over the last however many months or years. So what we wanted to test was, particularly in an organization as majority group dominated as this company was, would we see a backlash to that diversity focused message? And so,
Mhm.
would we be better off testing a
Mhm.
similar message that didn't speak about diversity at all, but had a
Mhm.
very similar message that was saying, think about how to build the most effective team possible. Think about what's going to make
Mhm.
you a higher performing team. Where are you strong
Mhm.
already? Where do you need to develop? What's missing that might make you a more effective, high performing team? And and we genuinely didn't know which one of those, we would call them treatments or interventions, was going to perform better. But we rolled it out over about a 6 month period. We got to about 3,300 hiring managers who hired for over 10,000 roles over this 6 month period.
Well,
It was a global experiment. We were in over 100 countries. Um, and yeah, I guess sort of the drum roll, the findings were that both of the videos, both the diversity video and the effectiveness video, were better than doing nothing, right? Were
oh,
better than just
interesting.
letting
Which one did
people.
better of the two? Or
Which
what
one
was
did better?
better, actually?
Well, exactly. So the better video was the diversity focused video. So the
Uh-huh.
diversity focused video led to a 12% increase in women being shortlisted, a
Mm-hmm.
13% increase in what the company called non-nationals. So
Mm,
this was the idea that I would be from the UK but applying for a job in
right.
India or wherever it might be, the reverse. And for non-nationals, we saw a 13% increase in
Mm-hmm.
shortlisting and a 20% increase in hiring. That was global findings, which overall we think are extraordinary as is, right? If
Mm-hmm.
companies could get a 12% increase in women and non-nationals moving through pipelines, that's
Right.
fantastic. But the effects in the country of headquarters were even higher, and we think that's because of the salience of who the message was coming from, the resonance,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that connection to
Mm-hmm.
the message and the messengers. And in that country, we saw that women were 32% more likely to be hired and non-nationals 51%. So really
Mm-hmm.
extraordinary effects. This has been written up by our academic collaborators in Science, which is one of the top journals in the world. So we're really proud of it, and think it's a real success story for how we begin to move the needle on some of the representation challenges that you were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I get a little frustrated when people are like, DEI training, diversity training doesn't work. And it's like, okay, well, tell me what the training is, right? And like you said, yeah, unconscious bias training, we know one session is not helpful and usually the opposite effect. But if we can really get that message closer to the time when decisions are made to the right people, I think your use case, your case study really pinpoints that. Like, it's not just the message, it's the messenger, where it comes from, and how that message is told. So
Mm-hmm.
there's different ways to do it. And I would argue it really has that message has to fit your culture. What is a high performing team at your in your culture? How do you traditionally define it? And there's almost always an element of innovation, psychological safety, belonging, inclusion. If you really get people to brainstorm, those words come up. And so it's almost like getting them to say it instead of it coming from this, Wizard of Oz type of, like I feel like sometimes we feel like it's like this message behind the curtain that's
Mm-hmm.
mysterious. But it boils up from the right people, especially the leaders of the organization. They're echoing its importance. It translates into results.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Was there anything that surprised you, Katrin, in that analysis? Was there like, oh, I didn't expect that, or, an aha that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think two aha moments. I mean, one, and I'm really struck. I sort of struggle with communicating this sometimes because we live in a world where people are often able to make claims about effects and impacts that are extraordinary, right? And we see people do this all the time. We're going to transform this and we're going to double this and triple this, and the ROI is going to be millions or billions or whatever it is. And so I think it's hard not to overstate the effects in that country of headquarters in particular. I mean,
Right.
32% more likely to be hired is in our world where the standards of evidence are high, right? They're academic standards. This was published in Science. So that is a very real effect that we saw, that means
Mhm.
that there are hundreds, thousands of women walking around this organization now that weren't before. So I think just the scale of that was really surprising for us. We're often, as behavioral scientists and experimentalists, we often see a 4% increase, a 6% increase, an 8% increase, and we're often proud of that because
Yeah.
it's real, right? And it's
Yeah. It
really there.
matters.
It's really better, right? But that's hard when we live in this world where the hype is real, right? So that was
Mhm.
one thing that I think really surprised us. Um, the second thing that really surprised us was that the second thing that really surprised us, I think, was sort of, as you'd begun to sum that up right then, just the impact of, yes, the message, yes, the messenger. You also described it brilliantly there as like getting to the right people at the right time.
It's
Like
like almost sounds like just in time DEI, isn't it?
exactly. So the right people and the right time. And it was those
Yeah.
four things that we've really honed in on as the sort of the secret sauce and the magic of this. If we can get the right message, the right messenger to the right people at the right time, we can have these really outsized effects.
Mhm.
And as
Yeah.
behavioral scientists, we, always had those clues, and that's often how we guide our work, right? Who are you trying to change their behavior? How are you going to do it? How are you going to get to them? What's the most impactful time to do it for them? But for us in our organization, this was one of our first experiments. The experiment was run back in 2022 that really sort of has unleashed the power of that. And that was surprising to us. We're now using that in lots of other moments and areas. So we've got it raises more questions than it answers for us as researchers, right? It works in hiring decisions. Does it work in all of those other moments that we spoke about earlier? Performance, promotions, succession
Mhm.
planning processes, reward and pay conversations, right? Everyday
All the
experience.
employee experience pieces, if we just put that inclusion filter on it and did, like you said, the right message at the right time with the right messenger.
Exactly.
I missed one of the components.
Message, messenger, person, time.
Oh, that right. There you go. But all of those like kind of, not that it's a check the box, but I think if I were a business leader listening to this, I would think, what's a key part of my employee experience where I'm not really seeing, inclusivity?
Mm-hmm.
It could be better. And
Mm-hmm.
I think every organization, if you're being honest, there's an opportunity somewhere. And that those are the good organizations that are looking for continuous improvement. So, yeah, as you go through, do you have a season where you do more hiring? Do you have a standard performance review cycle? We know that interventions work. We're reminding people before performance reviews and increases in promotion decisions that we just remind people about some of these biases that can creep up or remind them about being inclusive and what that looks like. Those nudges, I think, they can do a long way. I wonder, Katrin, for you, if you were just an everyday leader listening to this, what would be something actionable you could do based
Mm-hmm.
on this research?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say based on this research, really figure out what's the problem that you're trying to solve for, right?
Mhm.
And to be, that feels like an obvious thing to say, but to be as behaviorally specific about that as possible, right? So to really hone in on
Mhm.
whose behavior do you need to change at what moment
Yeah.
and why? Like, what is your data telling you about where there are gaps, about where
Mhm.
we may not be having the most inclusive experiences or the most inclusive
Yeah.
leaders? And so really getting as we sort of call it boringly
Yeah.
specific as possible
Yeah.
it helps, right? So we go from that, we want to build an inclusive culture to, okay, we really want to improve, leader behavior in one-to-ones, right? So that people can
Right.
feel safe,
Right.
psychologically safe, speaking up, raising issues, whatever it might be.
Mhm.
And that's generally where we tend to see the most impact.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, specificity. I like boringly specific.
Boringly specific.
And these little nudges though add up. People notice, like, oh wow, like that promotion like decision felt different. Oh wow, like the hiring class is different. I mean, people take notice of these things, and I like a healthy dose of peer pressure of modeling this so that it takes hold. And I think the big audience that we've missed in this research is middle managers. Like we
Mhm.
just, not in your research, but just in the industry in general.
Yeah.
Of course, senior leaders have to be bought in, but you really need people making these critical day-to-day employee experience decisions to
Mhm.
be to have it and from an inclusive mindset. And
Yeah.
they probably have little education on what that looks like and don't know any better. So you just kind of follow the outdated norms. And these little nudges can help you just tweak and get a little bit more inclusive so you get a little bit better outcomes.
Yeah.
Well, this is
Exactly.
awesome. Thank you for the research you do. Thank you for, this amazing work. I think having the discipline and data right now is our best defense against this persistent backlash. Katryn, tell our listeners how they can follow your work, get in touch, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn's always the best place to find people. So we're more than now on LinkedIn. I'm Katryn Wright on LinkedIn. That's generally where you'll find us. And vice versa, Julie. Right, a huge thanks to you for sharing the research that you share in your writing and in your voice. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for keeping the discipline there for us. And I'm really thankful for your work and thankful for this message. I'm kind of thinking of it as just in time in my own logistics days, like just in time deployment of some of these interventions or inclusion acts or inclusive lessons, whatever we want to call them. So
Boring
critical.
specificity, boring specificity behaviors, something like that.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you, Katrin. I really appreciate you.
Thanks, Julie, too.